So, should we get started? Awesome. My name is Curry Sotner. I'm the Vice President of Education here at the museum. And I want to first thank you all very much for braving what might not be the coldest day in the last few weeks, but still a very cold, dark winter night. So thank you for coming. And I promise that you will be enlightened and engaged, and hopefully we'll hear a lot of voice from the community, this community in the room tonight. We are so excited about this program, and Susan Seidenberg from Gilder Lehrman, who's really spearheading this program, will be out in a minute to tell you all about it. But what I wanted to do is just pause for a minute and talk about the Constitution Center. You all know us well. There's a lot of familiar faces in the room, but some new faces as well. And I think one of the best things that we do here at the National Constitution Center is talk about the Constitution, but it is also to have conversations and civic dialogue around the Constitution. And that's really what this project is about tonight, and that's what this institution is about. Not just having a place to learn about the past, but having a place to learn about the past, discuss the past, and have conversations about that and how it affects our future. So thank you all for braving the weather, coming out with us. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite Susan Seidenberg to the stage from Gilder Lehrman.
First, thanks to the National Constitution Center for partnering with the Gilder Lehrman Institute to present this town hall. I'm Susan Seidenberg. I'm Senior Curator of Exhibitions at the Gilder Lehrman Institute and the Project Director for Revisiting the Founding Era. This town hall, in which you are participating, is the first event of a 3-year project, a library outreach project to 100 libraries in 50 states, in which we will present programs that invite the community to talk about the founding era and how it might resonate for programs that people are talking about today and issues they're talking about today. The project is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Actually, it was the largest public programming grant that was awarded in the past year, for which we are eternally grateful. But I thought just to tell you just a few words about the Institute and what we do and how we came to do this project. The Gilder Lehrman Institute is rather young. It was founded in 1994, and the mission is to promote the knowledge and understanding of American history through programs and resources. At the present time, we have 65,000 documents in the Gilder Lehrman collection, which is the core of our programming, and the collection is drawn upon to do programs, to do outreach, to contribute to a website which is visited by 7 million people, and also to support a network of 6,500 affiliate schools to whom we send materials on a monthly basis, as well as teacher seminars. But it's the collection that really gives us the capacity and ability to bring people face-to-face with primary documents and to really engage in understanding the people, the events, and the controversies that shaped our history over time. Now, just to use a theater term, I'd like to say, enter Hamilton. Based on our work over the past 20 years or so, in 2015, Lin-Manuel Miranda and the Hamilton Group came and talked to the Institute about developing a Hamilton education program. With funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, we developed an incredibly important program to have Title I students come to a matinee of Hamilton. And in anticipation of their going to the matinee, they received a very, very robust educator's guide in which they got a chance to look at documents, to think about how they might plan a presentation, a skit, a song that was based on one of the characters or one of the events of the founding era. And they had a chance to perform this in the morning. I went to some of these performances, and they were really astounding. All of a sudden, kids were thinking about people. They were thinking about events. And the founding era wasn't something, this dusty thing, why should I study American history? It really came alive. And one student said to me, I fell in love with Hamilton, but beyond that, I started to fall in love with that dusty thing called American history. So this has been a program that has been not only successful, but now is replicated all over the country, wherever the Hamilton exhibition and the Hamilton musical go. And really, it was the success of the Hamilton education program that encouraged us to apply to the National Endowment for the Humanities for a grant to support what we call Revisiting the Founding Era, a document-based project over 3 years that will provide libraries with a reader, materials, and other resources to start conversations that we say, maybe, obviously, we are very different than those people were, but maybe some of their ideas and some of their events and some of their people resonate as we start to talk about what is of concern to us in the 21st century. The centerpiece of this project is a reader, and in your folders, you will each find a little packet called Revisiting the Founding Era Town Hall, in which there are 2 documents from this reader. All the documents in this little reader are from the Gilder Lehrman collection that the panelists will be talking about later this evening. And we encourage you to read the documents and join the conversation afterwards. At the present time, the Institute is working with the American Library Association to accept applications from libraries to host these community programs and to receive grants to do that programming. And I'm happy to report that as of today, 187 applications have come in, and the deadline is until January 30th. So we know there's an interest in this, and we're very eager to have the biggest distribution as possible. We'd like to have 2 programs in every state. So on your way out, if you see a little card with the information about applying for the program, please do take it and encourage your local librarian to submit an application immediately. Now, I wanted to come back to why we're talking about the founding era. Why are Americans talking about these ideas now? Obviously, Hamilton the musical has sort of blown across this country, and it's being visited by hundreds of thousands of people who try to get tickets to the show. With its multicultural cast and hip-hop score, Hamilton has sort of brought the issues of the founding era to the 21st century in popular culture. But from the perspective of learning and historians, more importantly, we believe that in these unsettled times, we're being bombarded by conflicting arguments, images from the press, from the media, from politicians, and they all base their views on the founding era. Well, what did happen in the founding era? And all these arguments raise questions about the fundamental nature of democracy in the United States. I recall the saying, you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And many people now are feeling they need to look back and see how it all got started. And in face of uncertainty about the future, it's more important than ever for us to consider the people and events and ideas that have shaped and supported our nation for the past 240 years. Please do look at the folder and look at the 2 documents. These documents will be the centerpiece of a conversation with panelists who are about to come up on the stage, and we invite you to join the conversation after the panelists talk about these documents and think about how some of these documents may resonate for issues about which you are speaking in your communities today. And now I'd like to introduce Carol Berkin, who will moderate the panel. Professor Berkin's CV is so long that I have to read it to you, so excuse me. Carol Berkin is the Presidential Professor of History Emerita at Baruch College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She is the author of several books, including First Generations, Women in the Colonial America, A Brilliant Solution, Inventing the American Constitution, Revolutionary Mothers, Women in the Struggle for America's Independence, Civil War Wives, The Lives and Times of Angelina Grimke, Verena Howell Davis, and Julia Dent Grant, who was the wife of Ulysses S. Grant. Wondrous Beauty, The Life and Adventures of Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, The Bill of Rights, The Fight to Secure American Liberty, and most recently, A Sovereign People, The Crises of the 1790s and the Birth of American Nationalism. Professor Berkin is a frequent contributor to PBS and the History Channel television, documentaries on early American revolutionary history. She edits the Gilder Lehrman online journal, which you can find on our website. We all invite you to visit our website. And she serves on the scholarly boards of several professional organizations, including the Museum of American Women, the New York Historical Society's Center for Women's History. And now I'd like to introduce Carol Berkin, and who will introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Hello. Greetings. I think we have some good conversation that's going to start up here, and then it's going to continue with questions from you. Susan asked me to talk a little bit about my connection to Gilder Lehrman. I've been working with them for maybe 20 years, and I've run summer seminars for them. I've done Teaching American History grants in states, virtually every state in the Union for them. I edit History Now, which is our online journal. I have done an online course on Hamilton, and now I am the director of the online master's program, which produced that course. The reason I do all these things for them is I believe intensely and sincerely in the mission of Gilder Lehrman and in their unbelievable devotion to bringing history to schools and to the general public. So I want to introduce the panel. We've been having a wonderful time all together. Denver and Julie and I have been on panels many times together before, and Farah is the newest addition to our family here. Denver Brunsman is Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the History Department at George Washington University, where his courses include George Washington and His World, which he teaches annually at Mount Vernon. His book, The Evil Necessity, British Naval Impressment in the 18th Century Atlantic World, received the Walter Cohen Memorial Prize for an outstanding work in 18th century studies in the Americas and the Atlantic world. He's also a co-author of a leading college and AP history textbook. I'll forgive him for that because it's a competitor with mine, called Liberty, Equality, and Power, A History of the American People, as well as the ebook Leading Change, George Washington and Establishing the Presidency. Farah Jimenez is a committed social entrepreneur, which means she likes to try and tackle large social problems with the thinnest of available resources. Currently, her focus is on improving the rate at which Philadelphia students graduate from high school and pursue college through a campaign called Project High School. As president and CEO of the Philadelphia Educational Fund, she oversees this campaign, as well as Philadelphia's longest-running college access program and its largest privately held college scholarship program. Prior to joining the Philadelphia Education Fund, Ms. Jimenez led the People's Emergency Center, a West Philadelphia community for families experiencing homelessness, and Mount Airy USA, a Northwest Philadelphia Community Development Corporation. Julie Silverbrook is Executive Director of the Constitutional Sources Project. She holds a JD from William & Mary Law School, where she received the National Association of Women Lawyers Award and the Thurgood Marshall Award, and she served as Senior Articles Editor on the William & Mary Bill of Rights Journal. She graduated summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, elected as a junior, from the George Washington University with a BA in political science. Upon graduation, she was awarded the GW Columbian College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Scholar Award, the highest academic award given to students in the Arts and Sciences College. So If you're doubting that these people are experts, doubt no more. I wanted to start with them, and now I'm going to join the panel. Want to be with you, by asking them just briefly to answer that question that every one of us who've ever taught history get asked eventually by our students. Why study history? What difference does it make? Why should we look at these documents? What value does it have? And I want you to answer it while standing on one foot and not cursing. Denver?
All right, no cursing. Well, obviously I'm biased, but I can't even imagine thinking about our present problems without having historical context, right? Now, history might not offer the exact answers to all of our problems, but I don't think we can even understand the problems without looking to the past. The eminent historian Gordon Wood has a great phrase. He talks about the fog of the present. You know, we often think about the fog of war, the fog of the past, but we all kind of live in a fog of the present. We don't know everything about our own times, and so I think we really need all the help we can get, and I think history can provide that. And I think there's an additional reason that's specific to America, specific to the United States, and it really has to do with the founding era. You know, this country was founded on a set of ideals, sometimes called a creedal nation, creed being the word there, as opposed to being founded on a certain ethnicity or religion or type of people. We're founded really on a set of ideas. And so I think we really have to go back to those ideas consistently. And I think that's one reason why our founding is so crucial and why this conversation is so important.
Thank you. Farah?
So I think as the non-historian in the group, I'll have a different response, which speaks more to probably the work that I've done my whole career, which is about unlocking people's potential. And so I would say that one of the key ingredients of that is really a sense of self. And that begins with having a sense of gratitude. I think understanding our history helps us understand where we've been and how grateful we should be for where we are right now, for the people who have sacrificed their lives to give us freedoms that we have and liberties that we explore today, for the incredible vision of founding fathers who helped create a country that's based on ideas and debate and community. And also because, quite frankly, even today, when we look back in history, how people lived and the quality of life that we get to live today is vastly improved. And the things that we don't like about our history can also inform our gratitude that they're no longer part of our present. So I would say from that perspective, it's important to look at that because it can shape a real sense of, yes, we are in a difficult place today maybe, but where we are, we've come a long way and we should be really grateful.
Thank you.
I'm going to repeat a lot of the same themes, and I think it's because it's true. I want to pick up on something that Denver said, though, which is we are not a country that is founded on a single unifying faith, single unifying race, ethnicity. What binds us together are these principles and the history of this country. And so I think particularly at a time of political polarization, it's so important to study that history and to feel that we have this common history that is sort of the glue that holds us together. And to go on something that you said, you quite simply cannot understand January 10th, 2018, unless you understand everything that came before it. And it's overwhelming because I'm not just talking about American history. You kind of have to understand world history too, but it's especially important if you're a citizen of this country to understand how we got to this present moment and how things that happened in 1776 and 1787 laid the groundwork for the increase in liberty and equality over time, and also, by the way, laid the groundwork for the present political conflicts of today. And something I think we're going to hit on when we're talking about these documents is there are perennial issues that come up throughout American history, and we're still in many ways having the same debates they were having when they were deciding whether or not they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation or start a new system of government, whether they were going to ratify the Constitution or not, whether they were going to add a Bill of Rights or not, whether they were going to modernize the economy or not. And those are the conversations that we're having today. history doesn't always offer that clarity and that solution. I think a lot of times people want to look to history for that, but it can provide a framework for understanding a path forward and to see how the compromises of the past were hashed out, right? And compromise, by the way, is a really important part of American history. Compromise both for good, and then sometimes compromise that was done and maybe now based on our modern morals we view as wrong. And we may or may not have the opportunity to talk about that, but slavery and the Constitution as a compromise to get the Southern states on board, that's a negative compromise by today's standards, but was considered a positive compromise in that it helped form the Union in the first place. And you can gain an appreciation for all of this by studying history.
Thank you, thank you. I take all of their courses. We chose 2 documents for you today that raise exactly the kinds of issues that we grapple with today. That is, we're still talking about power versus liberty. We're still talking about competing interests between regions or among regions. We're still talking about national versus state power and control. Alexander Hamilton got up in one of the rare moments that he spoke at the Constitutional Convention when he was listening to a discussion about federalism, which said, some power will be in the hands of the national government, some powers will be in the hands of the state governments, and some powers will be shared by them. And Hamilton, who never had much of a sense about the political mood, but always spoke his mind, got up and he said, this is just never gonna work. We'll just be fighting about who has ultimate power over issues forever. And of course, he was right. Of course, his solution at the time, at a time when states were the legitimate governments people knew and understood, and when people thought of themselves as Pennsylvanians or New Yorkers or South Carolinians, they didn't think of themselves as Americans yet. Hamilton's solution was just to abolish the states. And I've always pictured everyone in the room saying, sit down, Alex, take your medicine. So we have picked 2 documents that I think do 2 things. One, they introduce you to the human side of an era that is often written about as if everybody was a statue in the park with a pigeon on their shoulder, right? Great moments in American history. We're going to introduce you, I think, to the way in which it looked to the people who were living through it at the time. The first is Mercy Otis Warren to Catherine Macaulay. We're starting with 2 women from September 1787, and I'm going to ask Denver just to give a little background about who these 2 women were in case they're not household names in your household.
Yeah, so this is such an exciting document. It is from late September 1787, and it puts us at this moment just 3 days after the Constitution has been published in the United States, and you really get a sense of the wonder. And Mercy Otis Warren was a political advisor to the founders. She was a great writer, a propagandist, a historian. She wrote really the best early history of the American Revolution. Mm-hmm. And in this document, she's writing to another historian, Catherine Macaulay. And it's important to note that Macaulay's in England. And a lot of the really great letters we get from the founding era were actually written to her. A lot of the founders wrote to her, and she's not in America, so they have to explain things to her, you know, what's in the air, what people are feeling. And so, again, you really just get a sense of the astonishment and the appreciation that Warren had for the Constitution, even though she would eventually oppose it, and we can talk more about that. You know, she has this great phrase in this document. She says, this is going to set in motion the pens and tongues of the political world. You know, this is really something. And so I think that gives a little bit of a sense of why we chose this document.
Right. It's in your folder, but basically she's explaining to Macaulay, or telling Macaulay, that we stand at a kind of crossroads. do we preserve the sense of liberty and local control that we fought the revolution for, or are we going to be sensible and create a national government that can protect us from invasion and do the business that we need of a national government? She's going to come down on the side of it's better to have 13 separate sovereign nations than to recreate the terrors of the British government that just had been oppressing us for all these decades and centuries. So she's concerned about what is going to be given up in exchange for what is going to be gained, right? I mean, there's a kind of balance sheet she's trying to figure out, and she comes down on the side of, I don't want to support this Constitution. And Julie, do you?
Yeah, I just want to say, I mean, it's an extraordinary letter for a lot of reasons. One, I think it actually very succinctly explains where we are in late September of 1787, and just from a teaching standpoint, it's always very useful to have a fairly short document to demonstrate these points. And we can't go without underscoring these are two women in September of 1787, both of whom correspond with and provide advice to the major figures of the day. They are both published authors in their own name. One publishes a 3-volume history of the American Revolution. I think it's actually the first published 3-volume history. Catherine Macaulay publishes an 8-volume history of England. And they are political thinkers and they're political actors. And interestingly, they're talking about a document that doesn't really consider them, right? I mean, this is extraordinary. And they're not household names, just like you said, Carol, they're not, and they ought to be. And I think it's part of the reason why we selected this document, but also to say that, you know, she talks to people who have political disagreements from her own. She, you know, corresponds with Federalists. She ends up upsetting John Adams, but everybody upsets John Adams because she doesn't paint him very sympathetically in her history of the American Revolution. But it's significant that he cares what she says, right? It's significant that her opinion merited any kind of emotional response or response at all. And I don't feel like we could move off of that document without making note of how extraordinary that is, especially given how long women would wait for the right to vote, and then issues of equality that, you know, continue and persist to this day. To have female voices and strong female and influential female voices at the founding is so important. And one of the things that we're trying to do through this project, revisiting the founding, is to bring in different voices and to say, you know, it wasn't just all these stodgy old white men with property that were talking about this. Now, there were many of them that were like that, but there are people who look different and think different from that group, and it's important to bring in those voices as well.
And part of what's interesting about Warren voices when she opposes the ratification of the Constitution, she says, she appeals to the strongest emotional issue that the Anti-federalists use. She said, well, there's no guarantee of the liberties and rights of the people. How could you propose a new government that doesn't say outright at the beginning, these are the rights and liberties that are sacred that the people have, which eventually we get in the Bill of Rights. I think that I'm not saying it isn't genuine, but it is clearly designed to be the one issue that anti-federalists think will stir up the emotions of the voters, stir up people. Because in fact, the real anti-federalist stance was this means the power of the states will be diminished. They didn't want a national government that could set uniform currency. They didn't want a national government that could create a uniform code of commerce. Virginia and Maryland wanted to keep their gunboats on the Potomac aimed at one another to prevent goods and services going across without paying tariffs and without paying import and export duties, right? They didn't want to give up these kinds of state-controlled authority, especially states that were doing really rather well, that were powerful, that were influential. And so it's sort of interesting to see how today we think the appeal to emotional issues is a new idea. You know, oh boy, what a brilliant tactic. But in fact, 1787, Anti-federalists knew you can't get people really worked up about a uniform currency, but you can really get people worked up about the fact that our rights and liberties aren't being protected. And Warren is a very good example. It makes you wonder whether she understood that this was a ruse for many people, or whether she really hook, line, and sinker accepted this idea that that was the main objection that the Anti-federalists had. And this letter suggests that she was thinking quite high-mindedly about important democratic or republic issues. Whereas if you read a lot of Anti-federalist literature and letters between, say, Patrick Henry and James Monroe, you realize that they were politicians. They didn't want to give up power. And so I think the connection to what we know today is pretty striking in this letter.
So I think there are two really interesting things. One, I think that generally, I think the Anti-federalist focus on the Bill of Rights is sort of prescient, because I talk to the public about the Constitution, and if I ask you, what do you think the most important part of the Constitution, or what's your favorite part, inevitably somebody references one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights.
Right.
And so for a lot of people, that's really the central part, the heart, right, of the Constitution. And so having that be a talking point, I think, is prescient, because it continues to be a talking point, and it's not sexy to talk about, you know, the powers of Congress in Article 1, but really important, and they talk about it here at the Constitution Center, by the way. But people tend to, in their dialogue, they're talking about their rights and their liberties, and that's what she talks about. And I think part of the reason why she stays at sort of that high-minded level that you just talked about is because women weren't part of the political wheelings and dealings.
Exactly.
And so, you know, they sat and had their, you know, intellectual salons, and they're drinking tea, and they're talking about these things, and they're educated, and they're talking to their young people about it, and they don't have to deal with rough and tumble politics and the practical things. So it goes back to, yes, this is women pressing up against the sphere that women are in, but it's also somewhere where they're outside of the true political realm. They can intellectualize what's happening, but they're not on the ground actually dealing with politics.
Exactly, very well put. Farah, you want to say something?
Yeah,
about
sure. My reactions were a couple. One is that I think the most striking thing about the U.S. Constitution is how few words it was. That it was completely accessible to people. That now I think about the fact. In fact, when we were looking at the passage of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, my comment was there is as many pages in the Affordable Care Act as there are words in the U.S. Constitution, which means it's completely inaccessible to people. And we've ended up with a government that is really debating issues that require a PhD in very narrow areas in order to understand the content that's being debated. Or if you take the lazy way out, you just wait to understand it after you've passed the bill, which is what happened. So I think that's really telling, that there was enough thought to make it sure it was an accessible document that people could spend time reflecting and debating and considering. The other is also, I think that argument continues today, right? The difference in the balance of power between what do you want to give to the federal government versus state governments versus local governments. And I would argue with people that I've worked with often, even though they may be dependent and beneficiaries of federal largesse through government programs, in the end, they feel disempowered to really influence that and bring their voices and dissent at the very local level, the grassroots levels. So there has to be a real careful balance between these two systems of government, because those that don't have access to power need to be able to feel they can influence it, that they have some ability to have some agency over their own lives, and that generally will only happen if they're able to exercise that at the local level. At the federal level, as was made clear by one of the presidential candidates during the campaign, is when federal government makes changes, the big corporations can always figure out how they hire enough lobbyists so that they can circumnavigate those changes. But the smallest business, the smallest people have no influence, are the ones who are going to pay the price.
But isn't it remarkable that in 1787, the groups that had no voice, it was just assumed they didn't deserve a voice. I mean, there was no expectation really that women or enslaved African Americans or Native Americans or poor men ought to have a voice. Part of what's happened is American history and the struggles have gone on to provide political voice to everyone.
But I would argue that they did have
our
a voice.
Expectations increase, right?
But I thought one of the things I was hearing is that they did have a voice. They expressed it through communications. Now, they didn't have agency because they weren't able to exercise that in a voting booth, but they still had voice. And I think that's really powerful, that is still possible even today if you express your opinions in a way that can really influence thinking, even if you may not have agency.
And I think at this moment, it's important to bring in those voices, because we do spend a lot of time unearthing these correspondence, digitizing them, putting them up online. That's part of what we do. It's part of what Gilder Lehrman does, so that people can see this. And I'm going to paraphrase Oprah just at the Golden Globes, and everybody's talking about this speech, that when she became the first African American woman to accept this Lifetime Achievement Award, she said, "I'm not unaware of the fact that there are little girls sitting at home who see this, and that makes a difference to them." And so we cannot be unaware, as people who are engaged in public history, that when we bring these voices to light, there are little girls sitting at home who say, well, if she had a voice when she had no agency, and I live in a time when women can have both voice and agency, I should speak up. I should think about these things. I should become involved. And it becomes possible for these people to conceive of that when we bring in people who look like them. And so that's why I'm so glad that we selected this document to spotlight, because it allows for young women, and young men for that matter, to see that women can have a voice, and a very valid and important voice, by the way.
Yeah, and middle-aged men too. I'm incredibly inspired, and if you think about what people like Warren accomplished with the Anti-Federalists, we often think of them as kind of the losers of the founding era, but the spirit of localism, as you mentioned, lives on. And they secured the Bill of Rights. I mean, it's an amazing accomplishment that the original Constitution didn't have that, and through their opposition, they got that. And I think it really helped the American Revolution to succeed. We asked about, we talked about why history is important and why this period is important. Well, we still live with the American Revolution. We still live with the government that it created. And in large part because the Anti-Federalists were able to secure those liberties. And then they actually were champions of the Constitution after that, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's no permanent opposition in the United States. There's no group that runs to the hills and keeps fighting the revolution. I mean, we've had our problems, but there was agreement, at least on the basic structure of government at the founding moment.
And I also think the Anti-Federalists are having a moment, right? I mean, I think they win in other ways because, rhetorically, the rhetoric of limited government, the rhetoric of rights and liberties that are in Anti-Federalist writings, that's very important to the dialogue today. And one of the things that I do at concerts, I track behavior of who's searching what. And I will say that between 2015 and 2017, the number of views on the Anti-Federalist writings in our collection went up significantly, and you can track this. And so that, I think in a lot of ways, the Anti-Federalists are, in some ways almost, as important rhetorically. The Federalist Papers are no longer viewed as something of argument. It's just explaining the Constitution, but the Anti-Federalists, that's where the rhetorical firepower of, particularly people on the political right is coming from, and they're studying these documents, right? So we're still using the writings of the founding and other periods in American history in constructing our modern political arguments.
So now we're going to move to the opposite side. I am going to restrain from wrapping the introduction to this document. Let's look at Alexander Hamilton's excerpts from his Report on Public Credit in 1790. I'm an unabashed fan of Alexander Hamilton's. I admit that. Hamilton, of course, is much better known, even before the musical. He was much better known than Warren. He owns the $10 bill, right? He's had ups and downs. Hamilton and Jefferson have sort of taken turns being the model of what America stands for over the course of the centuries that followed. I think probably right now in a popularity contest that Hamilton would win, maybe not for all the right reasons. But in this case, his importance is extraordinary, I think. And the Report on Public Credit is he was made Secretary of the Treasury, which was exactly the position he wanted. Hamilton was not interested in running for public office. He was always much more a program and policy person, a policy wonk, than he was a public figure. It's very hard to imagine Alexander Hamilton kissing babies to get elected. His general point of view was, I'm brilliant, you're not, shut up, do what I want you to do. And the depressing thing is he was almost always right. I mean, it was horrible to realize that he was smarter than most people. But he became Secretary of the Treasury, and he immediately began an extraordinarily productive couple of years in which he shaped the trajectory of the American economy right up until today. I mean, this is the man whose programs and policies directed the rise of American capitalism, foresaw the rise of American manufacturing and industry. And I think even more important than those things, though heaven knows those are important, Hamilton was the nation builder. Every single program Hamilton produced and every single law he tried to get Congress to pass was designed to make Americans supporters of their national government. And you can see it in large ways and small ways. You'll see in this document that he wants to absorb the state debts from the Revolution. One of the reasons he wants to do this, if you are a fan of the Godfather movies, you know that you never kill off someone who owes you money, right? Because then they can't pay you.
You need that.
And at the same so Hamilton's theory was, if we can owe money to leading citizens in all of the states and give the promise of paying it back, they're gonna want our government to succeed. They're gonna want this federal government to do well because they're invested in it. And this runs through all of his reports, that really he wants to see people loyal to the national government. He wants to see people thinking that they are Americans together, not just Pennsylvanians, not just New Yorkers, not just Connecticut men, but part of one big enterprise. And the Report on Public Credit, aside from any of its intentions, is an extraordinary piece of work. When he came into office, the Treasury office, no one had any idea what we imported, how much we imported, what it was worth, what we exported. He puts that we didn't even know, they didn't even know. I wasn't around at the time. Many of my students think I possibly was, but I wasn't around at the time. No one even knew how much was owed or to whom. And he digs in, he does this incredible research, and he puts out not one, but actually 2 reports on public credit that suggest exactly what ought to be done. We should assume all the state debts. We should fund the debt. By this time, my students are going, what does that mean? I say, all it means is you have to guarantee that you will make regular installments, regular payments of the debt out of the revenue you collect. You're not going to use all the revenue, but you're going to guarantee that you make regular payments on the debt. And he went on to write 2 more pieces to his nation-building plan. I would argue that of all of the framers, he is the visionary. He's the one who sees we're an insignificant country now, but if you'll just do what I tell you to do, we will become one of the great countries of the Western world. And at one point, he writes a note to a British ambassador, and he says, basically, he says, we're a small, untested country, but look out for us because we're going to wind up your competitor. This is to the British ambassador. So he writes a report on on the creation of a bank of the United States, and he writes a report on manufacturing, how to encourage manufacturing, how to get people to invest in manufacturing, the role the government can play in this, because he wants to be a competitor of Britain, which is the primary. And Southerners in Congress don't allow this, because where will manufacturing be housed? In the North. And Virginians in particular see the handwriting on the wall, and they say, the trajectory of this man's vision will be to make us the second-class economy to this vigorous commercial and trade economy that he wants to produce. Had they passed the report on manufacturing, we would have had an industrial revolution much sooner than we did. So this is an excerpt from this report on public credit. And even if you don't like it, even if you're a tried and true Jeffersonian, you have got to admire the genius in this plan. I mean, the brilliance of this man is really quite startling, even though he really couldn't rap.
Absolutely. Just briefly, what strikes me when I read this report is he talks about the debt in moral terms. Mm-hmm. And we have the burden of our own gazillion-dollar debt. You know, in Times Square, the numbers are turning constantly. So I think it's hard for us to think of debt as a good thing. But I think Hamilton explains to us why it is, and for reasons that you suggest, that it binds the country together. It binds the different regions together. It's a common project. You know, we're in this together, and it will allow this nation to do things that it wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And in that sense, I use the analogy of a credit card. Maybe this is a dangerous analogy with college students, but I say, a credit card. Maybe a better analogy is your student loan debts. It allows you to do something that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. As long as you pay down, make the minimum payment, right? Pay down the interest. He's imagining America expanding, investing in things like manufacturing. And so, again, like the Warren letter, it puts us at this moment, this moment in the founding era that would have such amazing consequences.
Yes. I think it's really important, though, to read these reports together, because, yes, he thinks there's value in debt because it allows you to do certain things that you might not otherwise be able to do, but similarly, he thinks it's immoral to leave debt to future generations. And so you're going to create debt you have to have the means of paying it back. And that's why I think the report on manufacturers is so important to kind of pair with this. It doesn't end up being something that's passed, but he's thinking, okay, so we're going to assume this debt, how do we pay that back? And, you know, today we talk about this with, you know, whether or not we're going to have a balanced budget amendment, and we speak in the same language of morality that he spoke of, which is, if we're going to create debt, we should not leave that debt to our children and our grandchildren. And so, you know, again, we get back to these are the perennial issues. They were talking about it at the founding, and we're still talking about it today.
He has as his motivation for creating this debt, nation building.
Yeah.
There's a purpose.
Yes,
it's not
there's
debt
a
for
purpose.
debt's
It's
sake.
not just debt. At the same time, another remarkable thing is, he is an advocate of what in the 18th century was a radical, liberating economic theory, capitalism. He was an advocate of, I mean, today there are people who can boo and hiss over the very word. But when Hamilton talked about it in that moment in time, it was in opposition, for instance, to a feudal caste system that said that some people have more power because of their birth instead of their achievements, instead of what they can produce for their country. And I taught for decades students who were first-generation college students from all over the world. Baruch College was acknowledged as the college with the most diverse student population of any college in the country. And virtually every one of these kids was a first-generation college student. And they are the beneficiaries of Hamilton's philosophy. It's what you can produce, meritocracy. Hamilton believed in social mobility, in meritocracy, that there should be no laws that prevented, of course he said men, prevented a man from rising as high as his talent, his ambition, and his focus could produce. And so his version of capitalism, like the radical Whigs in England who came up with this notion, this philosophy, at that moment in time, it was a radical, liberating philosophy. And when you think about its progress or its declension, however you want to think about it, you have to realize those words meant something different in the 18th century. Debt and capitalism meant something very different than it means today. And that's one way of sort of measuring change over time, which is what history is really about.
Interestingly, my reaction to the document was a little differently. I was really looking at it at the nature and the construct of his political argument, in that there was an acknowledgement that there were winners and losers, as you had already outlined, and yet what he was calling upon is this idea of something much larger than that, that there is a morality around why we should agree that yes, there might be winners and losers, and you might be on the short end of this stick, but there's a reason that we're all willing to do this and should be willing to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think of it even today with going even the extra step that he went with what we would call today virtue signaling, that if you disagree with them, then you're not willing to pay back the price of liberty that we've all, that's on all of our credit cards, and that's the reason that we should be hanging together and being willing to do that. And often the arguments today may be an intellectual argument, but then we layer on this moral cause that is trying to make inflame the reasons why somebody should stand in one side of the aisle versus the other on an issue.
He says, in fact, in the document, debt is the price of liberty. We incurred this debt, and we ought to be willing to pay it because it is the result of a battle for independence. So he does have that moral, but I'm always struck by the changed connotation of words. I know people, if you say the word capitalism today, will boo and hiss and that restrains people. For men like Hamilton and his friends, this was what was going to free people. He founded one of the first, founded the first abolitionist society in New York, and he did it because he said, this is ridiculous. There could be well, he said black men, there could be black men who have great ideas, who can do wonderful things. We can't hold them in a caste that prevents them from doing that. So his idea that this economic system would liberate people was really, in his day, so different from the way many people think about corporations and their power and monopolies, and there's no chance for the little guy. That word capitalism changes its connotation over time, just like debt has changed its connotation over. We think of the national debt as irresponsibility. He thought of it as a way to help create a national identity. So it's very important, I think, to understand that the meaning of words change in historical context.
Another one's just economics, right?
Yeah.
Economics today, we joke in the academy, it's the dismal science. Well, back then, economics was really kind of a branch of philosophy.
Yes.
And so it was about ethics and morality, and we could probably have a little bit more of that today when we think about the consequences of our various, economic decisions and policies. And that's how Hamilton was thinking.
So now we've talked enough. We could go on forever, which I'm sure you're hoping we won't. Thinking about these documents and also thinking about what you've heard, we'd like to hear what you have to say. Unlike Hamilton, we're not likely to say, shut up, we know more than you do. We're likely to say, this is the whole project that NEH funded is really designed to get people in communities talking about these thorny, knotty problems that still exist today. So there are microphones on either side. Please don't be shy.
You can just, if you raise your hand, one of us will come to you.
Thank you. My name's Leo Lloyd. I live in New Jersey, and I'm just an ordinary person who reads a lot of history. I have a few questions for you. The first one, Mercy Otis Warren, was she Joseph Warren's widow? He was killed at Bunker Hill.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was James Otis's sister, James Otis Jr.'s sister, who was one of the early protesters of the change in British policy after the French and Indian War.
Taxation without representation is tyranny.
Yes, he was the writs of assistance case. And the reason she was so literate was that he used to sit at the table with her and share what he was studying at Harvard. I mean, she got an education basically because she was very close with her brother. It was not because anybody sent her to school or educated her, but that there was this close relationship. She was extremely fortunate in that regard.
Also, you talked about Hamilton wanting people in this country to own part of the debt. This would make them, that's why he wanted debt, so people would be invested in it and feel like Americans. But also, wasn't he worried about international credit, the United States credit rating internationally, which in those days mostly meant Dutch bankers, right?
Yes, absolutely. As soon as we had borrowed from the Dutch, we'd borrowed from the Spanish, we'd borrowed from the French, we borrowed from everyone but England, and we owed the money, and they were not being paid back. We were really pikers at the time. And what happens? Americans go off, ambassadors go off to these countries, and they ask for more money. Could you lend us more money? And of course, the response is, lend you more money? You haven't paid back a dime of what we lent you already. And Hamilton wanted to see European capital come into the country. One of the reasons why he wanted the hostility to England to end already. Well, he wasn't really Jewish, so he probably didn't say it that way, end already. But he said, there are people, entrepreneurs in England, who have built industries and manufacturing fortunes, And they are looking for some place to invest. Forget that they used to be our enemy. Let them invest in this country. And so one of the things he definitely wanted to do was develop our credit rating with other countries so that they would be willing to lend us more money. They would be willing to invest in America. I mean, he understood that that was terribly important.
Just one more question. I don't remember where I read this because I do a lot of reading about history, but somewhere I read that the Federalists won the battle, which was to get the Constitution ratified, but the Anti-federalists won the war because it was mostly Jeffersonian principles that ended up being, up until the Civil War anyway, that ended up being, it was his philosophy that prevailed. Jacksonian Democrats followed, his principles pretty much.
They were two streams that run through American history, and neither one defeated the other. I mean, they coexist in American history to this day. Sometimes one is up, sometimes the other is up, but mostly they represent, if you will, two ways of thinking about American society. And I don't think I would argue that neither one of them triumphed over the other. No one crushed Hamiltonian thought, and no one has crushed Jeffersonian thought. They're two sides of the way in which this country conceives of itself.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Irv Gross, and I too am a great fan of Alexander Hamilton. But my concern in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, I think the amendment that's most seriously violated is the 10th Amendment. I think that the concept of the country is of severely restricting the power of the federal government and leaving the power in the states and the people is a very critical part of the Constitution. And if you look at our history over the last 100 years, that has been to me, most seriously violated, with the growth of the administrative state, with the accrual of power of the federal government relative to the states. I think partly the problem is the term states' rights was damaged by the Civil War and the defenders of racial segregation. But I really think that we have not been as concerned about state rights as we should have been. And I think that's a serious part of the Constitution which we are suffering from, the violation of that 10th Amendment.
And this goes back to something I said earlier, which is the resurgence of anti-federalist writings and that rhetoric is exactly what you just expressed. There are a lot of people in this country who feel that the national government has expanded too much. And what better body of work to look to than the anti-federalists, because that's what they were concerned about. They were concerned. Now, the national government in the 1790s was considerably smaller than the national government now. Now, of course, the country was considerably smaller than it is now. But this goes back to why this project, I think, is so wonderful, and why all of us that are participating, and the Constitution Center is a part of this too, are facilitating these conversations. And it goes back to Carol too, these two strains of thinking, and how do we calibrate? Sometimes the national government is on the up, and then sometimes it ebbs and flows over time. And you see this right now. You have the expansion of the national government under the Obama administration in certain areas, and then you see President Trump comes in and repeals some of this executive action. And the sort of Republicans are about rolling back regulation, rolling back the power of the national government. And that changes depending on the administration and the political moment.
But it's also true that not only were we smaller then, but with the New Deal, the assumption that the federal government is responsible for the welfare of the people is one of the things that expanded the power of the federal government. Two things. When the war ended, World War II ended, we were in fact a world power for the first time. And that required an extension of diplomatic administration, and the idea that the federal government was responsible for the welfare of the men who wrote the Constitution did not think that the Constitution should be interested in people's personal health, in education, in the environment. I mean, those were not things that had anything to do with the role of a government. And so there was no need to have a CDC, you know, in case there was an epidemic. If there was an epidemic, there was an epidemic. That had nothing to do with the federal government. So part of what you have to factor in is that the assumption about what that federal government is supposed to do has expanded dramatically since the middle of the 20th century. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. calls it the rise of the imperial presidency, and he doesn't mean a tyrant. He means that now the federal government, in its position of power in the world, and diplomacy is under the president, has expanded dramatically the need for the expansion of that branch of government. And so some of this is situational. It's not a moral question so much, or I mean, do you want to leave the environment and climate change to Mississippi, Alabama, New York? Can those questions be resolved by a state government, by a local government? So some of these issues have become so much larger than they were for the men who wrote the Constitution, who, is it John Quincy Adams who asked for a lighthouse in the sky? He wanted an observatory, a national observatory, and people went, what? The federal government's not supposed to do anything like that. Today, the federal government does things like that.
And just to reiterate, you know, why this is so important, that's why it's important to study history, is to understand how we got to this moment. It's not just about, you know, the greedy people who want power in government, although that's certainly a dimension of it. There's also a public expectation for what the federal government will provide and protect, and that's a part of the story too. And that's why the narrative and individual voices that are brought out through this reader and through studying history are so important. You cannot, and like I said, you cannot understand January 10th, 2018 unless you understand the larger arc of history and how we got here. And nothing is preordained, right? I mean, if you would like to see more power given back to the states, anyone here, anyone watching at home, you have the power to organize to help see that happen. You know, you have the tools to do it. So, you know, get off your butt and do it. Don't just complain about it. I mean, I read a lot on blogs, right? And I read a lot about this, and that's great. But do something, and be thankful that you live in a country that affords you the opportunity to do that.
I thought that the conversation around state rights is also particularly interesting in terms of this discussion that we were having after the last presidential election, the most recent one around electoral college. Because I think people didn't really understand the history around it. And so the idea that we've gotten so used to a large central government that we were willing to allow just a pure democracy to be the decider around who becomes our president, rather than recognizing we are still a collection of states with regional differences and cultural differences. And whether or not we like it, how the result of the election, it was informing about that cultural difference, that there really is still a conversation and the debate that needs to happen amongst us as people who are influenced by the communities we live in, rather than just one long, large federal narrative.
So actually, I wrote a book about this. The Electoral College was not designed to make sure that rural states had the same authority as it was designed because they couldn't figure out how to elect the president. I mean, it was a Rube Goldberg invention. They thought that they could solve the question of the presidency fast because it was the least important branch of government. As far as they were concerned, the important branch of government, right? Article 1, Congress. And there was going to be a huge debate about that. So let's get this executive branch out of the way. And they got stymied. the fact that they couldn't figure out how to elect a president. Why couldn't they figure it out? Well, because people were localists, and they knew the person who represented them in the state assembly. To the great surprise of my students, Thomas Jefferson was not known in Connecticut. No one had ever heard of him. They didn't walk around saying he wrote the Declaration of Independence. They had no idea who he was. And to John Adams' great dismay, nobody had heard of him in South Carolina. There were only 2 people who were nationally known: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. Otherwise, even the men who went to the Constitutional Convention didn't even know other guys at the Constitutional Convention, never heard of them. So they said, how can we elect someone? Everybody would vote. If we had a one man, one vote, everybody would vote for someone they knew. We call them favorite sons. So we would have 600 candidates, and someone would have to decide. So that's not going to work. Well, maybe everybody could campaign on horseback. Are you going to go from Maine down to Georgia on horseback, knocking on farm doors? I mean, today we have, by the time a presidential election is over, you know every mole, every acne scar, you know hair growing out of their ear. You know everything about these people. You are so sick of seeing them. It's incredible. Well, there was no such media blitz in the 18th century, and who's going to get on a horse and ride? First of all, the campaign would take 6.5 years, and second of all, you'd have so many saddle sores. They could not figure out what to do. And James Wilson, very early on, comes up with this idea. And everybody goes, oh, that's a terrible idea. And at the very end of the convention, the Committee on Postponed Matters, that's my favorite committee ever in the history of government, the Committee on Postponed Matters.
That's just our whole government.
Yes, right. Sits down and says, how about that idea James Wilson had? And they say, yeah, that's it. First of all, because they all wanted to go home. They'd been sleeping 3 to a bed in taverns and eating tavern food for 4 months. Tavern food makes Wendy's look like a really great restaurant. They wanted to go home. And they said, yeah, that's a great idea. So the Electoral College did not have really any high-minded ideas about balancing rural and urban, or about letting certain states have the same number of votes as others. It was just, how the heck are we going to elect this president? And we have, again, that's a reason to study history. You can watch the Electoral College have baggage added to it until today it becomes, one of the great statements is, presidential candidates wouldn't visit our state if there weren't an Electoral College, right? There are all kinds of claims for it and against it, that the men who wrote the Constitution, if they were alive today, would go, what are you talking about? That's not why we designed it. The whole idea of the Electoral College was the state legislators would choose people to be electors who had served in the national government, and so they knew people. So that when John Adams ran for the president, someone could say, oh yeah, that little short fat dude, I know him, he's okay. They couldn't still be serving in the national government because that would be a conflict of interest. But they had to have served in the, because everybody knew Washington would be the first president. So whoever had served in the national government could be an elector. And the other really interesting thing about this is the Electoral College never meets together to cast their votes. They vote in their own state, then the results are sent to the Congress, and they're counted. Why? I have heard some of the most outrageous statements about why. The reason why is these men were terrified about the rise of an oligarchy or a conspiracy, and they said, if these men all meet together, if you think there's paranoia today, let me tell you, there was paranoia then. If they meet together,
they'll choose one of their own to be the president, and then they'll all rule together. Or even worse, France or Spain will bribe them to choose I'm thinking about today and laughing, bribe them to become president, and then they'll become a satellite of France or England. So the circumstances in the 18th century bear no relationship or little relationship to the circumstances of the Electoral College today. You need to really know how things evolved to make a decision about what we need today, I think.
I think we have one more question, quick answers, and then we'll wrap it up.
At the beginning of the discussion, you were talking about these kind of contradictions that existed throughout the history and in the documents and things, and you talked about power versus liberty, national versus state, and kind of regional conflict. And I'm kind of looking at the way it is today, or at least seems to be, and it seems like we're having a lot of the same conversations, just maybe played out in different discrete subject matter. So I was wondering if you thought that there was anything that if any of you thought that that was the case or not, or if there was anything that was a kernel to find in some of these documents to really help figure out how to resolve these.
I don't think documents from the past provide a blueprint for how to solve our problems today. They're not like, oh, gee, if we just read what they did then that's an answer. X marks the spot as an answer. But I do think that since these issues continue to be real issues today, that, as I said, I think we need to know how they evolved and how they have changed over time, and why they have changed over time, so that we can we're really on our own. The past is not going to come tap us on the shoulder and say, psst, here's the solution. We have to make those decisions ourselves, but the more we know about how we got here, the better able we are to know what the future might be, what we ought to do for the future.
And we've talked about this a couple of times tonight, and I'm mindful that I think we're over time, but the balance changes over time, right? And so, it may just be that there's never a solution to this. It's just a recalibration, right? We talk in the language of balance of powers when we talk about our system of government. And it's really just a recalibration depending on the moment, right? Depending on where the public is, depending on where the government is, depending on what we're confronting as a nation. That's what alters the balance. And understanding history helps you understand why the balance is the way that it is right now. And it helps you understand, well, we were just talking about recalibrate that balance, how do I do that? Well, you can learn from the past what was effective, what was ineffective. But you also have to have an appreciation for the fact, just like Carol said, things are very different now than they were then, and that in and of itself impacts the balance. But I don't know that you're ever going to have, and I get this question all the time, certainly history tells us the answer to this question one way or the other. And I said they were arguing about the same thing back then. I can give you 10 people who support your view, and I can give you 10 people who supported your opponent's view. And that's, I think the lesson of history is it's not neat, it's messy, it's very messy, and we have to get comfortable with that uncertainty, and studying history helps you do that. And it helps you wrap your mind around that idea.
I would just say, though, the lesson of history, the lesson of history is that people are willing to have the debate and to have the discussion. And I had shared a story earlier about a community meeting where a number of young people came in and voiced their opinion, turned on their heels and left. And the next time that they were present at a similar public meeting, I looked at their adult leader and I said to him, you have got to instruct your kids to sit with the discomfort of listening to opposing views from other young people who are here too, but sit on the very opposite side of this question. And to his credit, he had them sit. And I think that's a lesson of history. They were at least talking to each other and reading each other's comments and debating and having violent debates about the topics, but they were willing to sit with the discomfort and argue with their neighbors. And I think, unfortunately, that's increasingly not what we're doing.
And with uncertainty about whether they'd ever find a definitive final solution. When you're growing up, do you remember that feeling? Gee, by the time I'm 40, everything in life will be settled. Maybe good, maybe bad, but it'll all be settled. There won't be any issues anymore. It does not turn out to be true, right? And I think we have to deal with that in our country as well.
Yeah.
We've kept you perhaps longer than you want to stay, but thank you so much for joining this conversation. And on behalf of the Gilder Lehrman Institute and the National Constitution Center, please keep following the development of Revisiting the Founding Era and visit our website, www.gilderlehrman.org. And again, thank you for being the first phase of a 3-year project. Again, thanks.
Thank you.